Hi, I'm Cal Barron and welcome to our WK Goodman's Legal Thinking podcast. Since the coronavirus pandemic more than 5 years ago, there's been a huge increase in active travel within the southwest. In Bristol and Bath, we've also seen the more commonly used e-scooters take effect. But how does this impact the average person, and how does it impact you on the road? To talk about a lot of these topics, I'd like to welcome our guests. So from RWK Goodman, Charlotte Webb, a senior associate in the personal injury team. Patrick West, a barrister at St John's Chambers.
Hello, Carl.
And Pete Dyson, the bike mayor of Bath and also a behavioural scientist at the university.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Pete, I want to start with you purely just out of curiosity. Bike mayor of Bath, what does that represent?
Well, a bike mayor, there are 15 of us in the UK, 150 across the world, and it's an independent voluntary position run by a charity based in the Netherlands, it happens, somewhat the home of cycling, and tries to fill that gap between kind of citizens and governments. Bike mayors might do anything from organising local events like children's bike rides, Kiddical Mass as the name goes, answering people's questions if they have concerns about new cycle infrastructure that's gone in, or if someone's had an injury, they'll email my inbox, and then I'm a sort of critical friend to the council to try and give them some representation or some pointers from a sort of people's perspective.
Absolutely. I imagine it's a role that potentially could be tricky at times. I think it's fair to say the relationship between cyclists and the rest of the road users at times can be a bit fractious.
Yeah, that's fair. You've got to thread the needle, and I think everyone's got to have a bit more balance. Yeah, we'll get into that.
Absolutely. I think a great point to start with is let's talk about what this region in terms of Bristol, Bath, the southwest has seen in terms of travel and how people use the roads, especially in terms of cyclists, how that's changed over the last 5 years since the coronavirus pandemic started.
Past 5 years, yeah. I went back to some statistics actually, because we're now in a fairly firmly post-COVID world. I don't think there's much sense that there's still a rebound happening, is there? Which we might have said maybe in 2023 or so. Well, most of the walking on active travel is walking is up. Cycling is sort of where it was, maybe down a bit. People talk about stages versus distance. Similar number of bike trips as there were in 2019. Similar sorts of amount of distance. So yeah, the COVID saw a boom, and it's now flattened back to a plateau, which I think a lot of behavioural scientists would probably say is broadly what you'd expect. The infrastructure hasn't changed a great deal. Our lives, if anything, involve slightly fewer trips than they probably used to. So let's go into a bigger picture, but the UK nationally, we take a slightly fewer trips each year than we used to, than 10 years ago, than 20 years ago. But of course, a few more people on this island, so population growth means a few more people packed in a few more places.
Absolutely. It's quite interesting that you touched on the fact that cycling has kind of remained around the same as where it was pre-COVID, when one of the things that has probably changed since then is the highway code and the rules that, around the road itself. Patrick, I'd like to bring you in here in terms of the highway code and how that's changed in the last few years. What does that look like?
Well, I think it's changed quite substantially. It's the first time really that we've seen, and these changes came in from January 2022, so they've been around for a little while, but it's the first time that we've seen the hierarchy of road users being spelled out. And it's something that as a lawyer, as a barrister, certainly I've been familiar with it. I think Charlotte will have been as well. But a lot of people, when you're out on the road driving, you don't think of yourself as being part of this hierarchy of road users. The new code sets this out formally at rules H1 to H3. And essentially, it's recognising that some road users pose a greater risk than others to other road users. So essentially, you've got the largest vehicles at the top, which have the greatest capability of causing harm. So that the HGVs, the articulated lorries, the buses, then the smaller vehicles, the vans and minibuses, cars, taxis, and it goes down right the way through motorcyclists, obviously they can cause serious injury, but equally they can be very badly injured because they don't have a big box of metal around them. So they are lower down, they're more vulnerable. And then horse riders, cyclists are the second from the bottom, and then it's pedestrians who are the most vulnerable. So that's the way that the code is now setting it out. Interestingly, as I say, this has been recognised by the courts, which in this country generally approach things on a common sense basis. So, little quote here from a case back in 2002. Court of Appeal in the case of Lunt and Khalifa, and the judge in that case said that the courts have consistently imposed on the drivers of cars a high burden to reflect the fact that a car is potentially a dangerous weapon. And that is true. I mean, it's not used as a weapon, of course, not generally, but it has that capability.
Charlotte, I'd like to bring you in here. In terms of that hierarchy of roads, how is that both in terms of been understood by clients that are coming to you when they suffer an injury on the road, but also how does that impact the process when this comes to the legal system? How has that been working through on your side?
Well, yeah, I think as Patrick says, it's common sense, really. Like the hierarchy of road users, although it's only come in the Highway Code since January 2022, it's something that we should all be common sense to us and we should all be considering. And yeah, the courts have been basically adopting that approach anyway. So it's more just really formalising that with the Highway Code, giving that guidance to people. So when, claims are coming through, it's just making sure that that's being adapted across the board.
I guess in terms of when a claim comes in and you have someone who obviously has been one of the more vulnerable, so a pedestrian or a cyclist, for instance, in this case, are there additional risks that they need to be looking out for when on the road from a legal perspective?
Yeah, so something I always think about, I had a claim a few years ago where it was a pedestrian crossing a road at a particularly busy time. There was a queue of traffic, but then, cars were going around to take past, and they were passing through the traffic and then basically kind of ran out in front of the cars that were passing through. And with the Highway Code, one of the new things is that junctions, pedestrians basically have right of way, especially if there's a junction, especially if they're already in the road, cars should be slowing down for that. So I do think that one is a slight change, but also that, my advice to my friends in everyday life is just never run across the road, because it just doesn't give cars, your time to react or slow down to you. And that's really what's important. Can a car actually stop and accept the pedestrian, know where they are, and be able to slow down and stop? And
I guess, Pete, touching on how obviously the changes to the Highway Code have impacted cyclists, has there been any kind of, in your role as the bike mayor of Bath, has there been any kind of additional information or feedback that you've gotten from the city's cyclists in regards to these changes? Are they finding it more difficult? Are people kind of still keeping things the same? How is that?
I think they do find it difficult. I think it's actually quite well known among cyclists because the latest updates affect cyclists and people who would identify strongly as pedestrians. I don't have the data to back this up, but I think it's more common knowledge that these changes have happened. But the rub of it is cyclists are then in a bind because they know that not everybody else knows the update to the Highway Code. So YouGov did some polling 1 year post its introduction, so that would have been January 2023, and found that 66% of people were unfamiliar with the Highway Code updates, and unfortunately only 30% of people correctly identified the passing distance that you should take going past a cyclist. 30% isn't great given it was a multiple choice question of 4 options. I know, so that's pretty much by chance. So, I think cyclists are in a bit of a bind because they know maybe the law's on their side, but that doesn't help you if someone's going to turn on top of you anyway. And the work to be done is clearly what should have happened when the Highway Code was launched, which was a much stronger set of communications, the kind of with paid media, with press releases, with door drops, with education. Because to some extent, the law in this sense is only as good as the level of awareness of it.
And I imagine that would have knock-on effects, the lack of education to some degree when it comes to bringing these claims into the legal realm, where, Charlotte, for instance, if you have a claim from a road traffic accident and the driver goes, oh, well, I didn't know that was the roads of the rules of the road. Is that something that you're seeing in practice?
Well, I guess it doesn't really matter if they know the rules or not, they're the rules. And for us, I'd be doing myself out of a job, but in an ideal world, these accidents just wouldn't happen. We don't want them to happen. We want to reduce them as much as possible. And so, it's really, really important that the information is getting out there about the highway code. Because like you say, Pete, although, cyclists are probably quite well aware of what the rules and the changes are, car drivers might not be, and pedestrians might not be as well. It's about getting that information out.
Absolutely. So I am happy to throw my hands up here and say I'm not a cyclist. So I would not be fully aware of the kind of rights that cyclists may have under the highway code. Patrick, what kind of rights do cyclists have on the road when it comes to these new rules?
Well, certainly the new highway code provisions have boosted road safety for cyclists a good deal. That point about how do people know what's in the rule, obviously if you're doing a driving test, so new car drivers at the very least ought to be aware of all these rules. Cyclists, thanks to people like Pete and campaigning generally, they have a good awareness. The one group that probably don't have a lot of awareness are pedestrians, because you don't have to do a driving test to be a pedestrian. And for example, one of the advantage of the rule that Charlotte's mentioned, which is H1 about giving way at junctions, that's giving way to pedestrians. Pedestrians have to cross at a place where drivers can actually see them. So the rules are very common sense about that. That's Rule 8. And so there are rules, in fact, for pedestrians as well. But the problem is getting that across. But in terms of cyclists, a lot of what's gone into the rules in 2022 and is now current are things that cyclists have been, I think, campaigning for many years. So recognising that cycling in the middle of the lane is a really good thing to do. So that's Rule 72. The basis of that is that it's all about visibility, and that makes you safer. If drivers can see you, then it reduces the chance of you becoming an accident victim. Obviously, you use it sensibly. The rule says if you have to let other faster moving traffic pass, then pull over, but use the centre of the lane. Priority at roundabouts, so cyclists now have priority under Rule 186. Previously, one of the only vehicles that was really singled out was articulated lorries, long vehicles, because they have a different route. But cyclists have got not exactly protection, but certainly drivers should be more aware and should be giving way to them on roundabouts. You can cycle 2 abreast, that's Rule 213. So again, that comes back to the visibility point. There are further rules for cyclists which are again protecting pedestrians and horse riders as well. So there are some provisions about how cyclists should behave around shared space as well.
Pete, just touching on that from a cyclist perspective and a behavioural science perspective, do you think these rules are useful in terms of helping improve that safety of people on the road when they're cycling?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think people would welcome that the highway code has been updated, and it's a sign of moving in the right direction, of a balance of hierarchy, but of cooperation and of knowledge. And for sure, there's still more work to be done. There's more work to be done for communicating them, like I said, but also maybe some more things in the environment that give more sort of behavioural cues. So there might be some road signage elements, there might be some paving design things. And with respect to shared space, there was some other research done actually on understanding of that blue circle sign with a pedestrian and a cycle symbol. A knowledge of what that meant wasn't particularly good until you add the word in block capitals "shared" at the bottom of it, and then suddenly, obviously, understanding of what that sign means goes up and up. There's probably a bit more to be done on these kind of canal paths, river paths, for a little bit more updating of the kind of dotted lines or the ways in which we might share space and understand whether it's you're recommended to ding your bell or whether dinging your bell is considered impertinent. But it strikes me as a psychologist that all these things are elements of cooperation and an understanding of trusting others, of second guessing or understanding what others are going to do, of etiquette, and there's degrees of politeness that sit alongside or maybe above or below the law. Yeah.
Charlotte, I guess just building on that, obviously we've talked a bit about the rules and where things can be improved. When, God forbid something does go wrong and someone gets into an injury or gets into an accident, suffers an injury as a result of it, how does that all kind of play out in the legal aspect? What are they doing in that first instance once they've suffered an injury?
Well, obviously, if there's any criminal offence that's happened, they should obviously be reporting it to the police, making sure they're getting the medical attention, the urgent things they need to begin with. But if they think there might be a legal claim, just get advice as soon as possible, really. And even if you're not sure, my firm and many other firms, we offer initial free consultation by telephone. We can chat things through to see if there is a potential claim there or not. And then it's about kind of building that evidence behind it to see where there is, because of everything we've been talking about today, the highway code, there is a lot of nuance to it as well. And sometimes it's not particularly clear who might be in the wrong, or if there is a legal basis there or a claim there. So it's about making sure you've got all that evidence. And, with technology coming on now, there's different evidence that's coming out that we simply didn't have before. A lot of cyclists, a lot of cars, buses, they have cameras on them. They might not be involved in the accident themselves, but that's why it's really important early on to get that information, get that advice, see if you're able to get witnesses, other vehicles involved to show what really happened. And not only that, also a lot of cyclists use Strava, and the data from that can actually be really helpful. Obviously, it's not completely accurate, but it can be an indication as to placement or speed, or kind of time of day that something in particular happened as well.
Absolutely. I imagine that's quite a big change over the last probably 10, 15, 20 years, is that move towards a lot more data coming through and information being gathered, especially when it comes to accidents on the road. As you said, you've got dash cams, you've got GPSs, you've got a million other things that are all coming into systems all the time. How useful is that, both in terms of building that evidence needed for claims, but also ensuring that safety can remain a significant matter?
Yeah, it can be really, really helpful. I specialise in brain injury claims, for example, and a lot of people that come to me that have had an accident, had a brain injury, they simply cannot remember what happened. Sometimes for a good period before, they can't remember the actual accident, and sometimes for a good period after. So, they're a witness that we're not able to use. So this data, this hard evidence can be really, really helpful to those types of claims.
Just jumping to a kind of slightly different area altogether. Obviously, we've talked a fair bit about cycling, we've talked about pedestrians. One thing here in the Southwest that I think a lot of people see on the roads day in, day out are e-scooters, e-bikes. They're a significant thing. Obviously, we've got schemes in Bristol and Bath that encourage the use of these as a way to avoid getting on the bus, using cars in the centre. How does this impact the road usage, and how does this impact general safety?
I can probably answer that one for you, Cal. I mean, there are scanty figures, but there's a gradual build-up of data. There was a set of figures that were released by Avon and Somerset Police, I think, back in 2022, and that showed that in the Bristol area, at least, I don't think it covered their entire force area, but in the Bristol area, there'd been about 100 serious road traffic accidents involving people being killed or seriously injured, and of those, 10% involved e-scooters. We need to be very mindful when we say e-scooters, because there are two very clear categories at the moment, albeit that's not clear to most people. The legal scooters are the ones that are part of the government scheme, and they're usually these brightly coloured, they look a bit more substantial e-scooters, and you'll see them gathered in rows on the street where you can just pick them up using an app and pay for them. Most of the scooters on the road at the moment, though, are illegal. They are electric scooters bought off the internet, often by parents for their youngsters, and they're being used illegally, unfortunately. That is still the case. So we are starting to see an impact. They're clearly going to be vulnerable as vulnerable road users. Most people don't wear helmets, so head injuries, the sort of cases that Charlotte deals with, are likely to be more likely in those cases. And so I think it is a concern, mainly at the moment, I think, for the safety of the e-scooter riders themselves.
Yeah, I mean, anecdotally, as someone who takes a fair bit of public transport in Bristol, Bath and the area, you do see a lot of people on e-scooters just kind of weaving in and out of traffic at times, no helmet, no It obviously quick to get around, but there is that question of, well, if a car hits you at 30 or 40 miles an hour, that's going to hurt quite a bit. From a safety perspective, what should people be doing when they're using these, both in terms of the illegal ones until they're kind of legalized or something is reached there?
The interesting point about the illegal nature of them, and no doubt lots of motorists will say, oh, they should be taken off the road. In terms of a civil case, so if there is a road accident and a judge is given the job of trying to apportion blame, the mere fact that that scooter is illegal may not necessarily be decisive. The most recently reported case of an e-scooter injury was a lady in North London in Barnet who rode her scooter into a pothole and was injured. Unfortunately, in that case, it failed because of for other reasons. It wasn't the issue of illegality that was the main issue, but if I can quote from a recent case actually in 2018 of Wallet and Vickers, and the judge in that case said, well, careless driving is a criminal offence, but nobody would suggest that careless driving by the claimant prevents the recovery of damages in road traffic cases where both drivers are partly to blame. And that was a case where two motorists were racing each other at excessive speeds on a dual carriageway, and it wasn't a bar to bringing a legal claim. So just the fact that an e-scooter is illegal on the road, it has to be very much central to the issues in the case rather than just being the background to it.
And I guess, Charlotte, as someone who works a lot in regards to brain injury claims, what should the average person who's using these e-scooters be doing? I'm assuming a helmet will help, but it probably isn't the full solution.
Yeah, well, obviously, as we were saying earlier, they should be very aware of the highway code. I think to do the legal scooters, you have to have a provisional license. So you should have, some knowledge of how to be on roads anyway. Whereas obviously for the illegal ones, the private scooters don't necessarily have that, but that's really the first step. And then, a helmet is best, obviously. And, for cyclists and for e-scooters, wearing a helmet is advised, but it's not illegal not to. And a helmet can only really properly protect you if it's quite a low speed impact anyway. And for high speed impacts, it doesn't make much of a difference. There's steps that can be taken. Obviously, just be aware of your surroundings and how the roads are working, because you are on a road with other road users with much bigger ones than you. It's really important for anyone using a road to be aware of the rules and what you should be doing.
It probably helps if you've been a cyclist, actually. I mean, I'm sure people would think that as well, that because e-scooters are permitted by law, the hire scooters are allowed to use the cycle lanes. And I think once you start thinking like a responsible cyclist, if you're on an e-scooter, then mostly that would protect you.
Pete, I was going to touch on that. I mean, I guess is there that mindset of having a responsible way of cycling, converting it to that kind of e-scooter approach. Is that the way that we'd be wanting people to kind of look out when it's getting on the roads in those?
Yeah, well, I think your question probably plays into the fact that this is my general thesis. This is transport for humans and for people, right? So we want to. Someone's unlikely to be only an e-scooter user. They will have also lived their life as a pedestrian growing up. They will have probably learnt to cycle at some point as a child. So there's a socialization of knowledge that happens across lots of things. And a bright future is one where people can choose to travel by lots of means, and they're fluent in lots of ways of traveling. But the bedrock of that probably is understanding the nature of both road safety and the highway code, irrespective of what mode you're going to travel by. I mean, I'd add actually that given that we're talking about the Southwest, Bristol is somewhat of a national leader when it comes to both a successful e-scooter scheme, but also a leader in research and understanding of what's going on. So, thanks to University of Bristol and University of West England, there's a lot more that's understood about who's using e-scooters, the accident rates, close connections with hospitals to understand hospital admissions, with Stats 19 data from the the police, but even nice behavioural questions about saying, okay, how many journeys are sort of new journeys that e-scooters have enabled, which we generally think is probably a good thing, and how much of it is sort of what's called a diversion factor of people switching from driving to e-scooter, perhaps there's a sustainability or congestion advantage sort of there, but how many people is it diverting from walking or from cycling? I won't go into all those numbers now, but it's a sort of a broad picture, and as you'd imagine, it's not pulling any one person from all different modes. But some really recent research that would be of interest to people is from University of Bristol, which just came out a couple of weeks ago and found that there is a sort of safety in numbers effect, that the addition of the e-scooter scheme within Bristol appears to have improved safety rates among e-scooter users and cyclists. So that theory that like the more two-wheelers or the more smaller traffic you get on the roads, you get a sort of herd effect, which is promising. Yeah.
So it's really interesting, that kind of confidence in numbers sort of herd mentality building in and helping with road safety is really quite interesting, I think. How useful is that kind of behavioural data to help influence policy? If obviously other towns and cities across the UK can say, if it's working in Bristol, why can't it work here?
I think it's critical. I mean, at the moment, we've got the UK is very much needs to have national regulation, and this is useful. This is a legal podcast because this is challenging my thinking to think. Yeah, we generally have national laws. We don't really accept the fact that there would be local legislation over many things. Although we could go into things like pavement parking, for instance, which London has particular rules, but other places don't. Yet. So there might be some localized things that come in. But ultimately, on the point of e-scooters and micromobility, it's all bound up by this bill in Parliament, which has been long awaited, I think, bound up with the other future transport bill, which would put it with a bunch of other technology regulation. But it doesn't look like it's happening particularly anytime soon. At the moment, we're in a perverse situation in the UK where private e-scooters are not legal, but rideshare schemes continue. You could take the Eurostar over to Paris and you get precisely the opposite situation, that there are no rideshare government-run sort of private schemes, but you can own your own one. So the jury's out in a way about how this is going to play out, but this kind of research of what e-scooters are good for, who can use them, how they can use them, is going to be fundamental to shaping the policies that are going to play out in the next few years.
So is that bill then potentially the next step forward for improving road safety, especially for cyclists, e-scooters, riders, pedestrians, that next step further? Yeah,
I think so. You get this problem a lot with the things that are not legal, in that you disable people's ability to communicate and give good advice over it. So the same sort of challenges seen over drug use as well. But staying on the topic of e-scooters, is local authorities, of which I've spoken to many, can't do messaging about here's how to ride your private e-scooter safely, because they feel they would be seen to be endorsing an illegal behaviour, but it is happening out there anyway. So they're not really on the stage of recommending helmets or teaching people how to use those scooters. So sooner the better, really, with respect to some kind of regulation and legislation, because there's going to be something. We just don't know exactly what it looks like yet.
And I guess Charlotte and Patrick, both different parts of the law, but I mean, I guess in terms of navigating that minefield between legal, illegal scooters and advising, depending on when, Charlotte, in your case, injuries come in, or Michael, when you're being instructed, how does that impact both, I guess, the advice you'd give and also how these kind of claims play out?
Well, I suppose the extirpi, as it's called in Latin defence, the illegality defence, is something that we would need to consider. I think each case will turn very much on its facts, though, in that sense. So whether the illegality of the scooter is really central to the way the accident happens or not might be a question you'd discuss. I think most of the time, however, if I had a client, a lay client who's on an e-scooter, or indeed if I'm representing a motorist who's been involved in an accident with them, I think a lot of it's going to turn on the sort of issues that Charlotte and myself have already talked about. It'll be about negligence. It'll be about whether or not the riding, in the case of the e-scooter, or the driving, if it's a motorist, whether that fell below the standard of the reasonably competent driver. That's really the only test in civil law. And that is informed by such things as the highway code and the rules of the road signs as well, road markings. And so it's, again, it's fairly common sense. Ultimately, there are many cases where it isn't just one road user's fault either. So the issue of contributory negligence might then arise. And I think that it kind of plugs into this whole idea of the hierarchy of road users. Certainly, now that we've got that recognised in the Highway Code, it might become a firmer way of looking at contributory negligence, that probably the more vulnerable road user might be seen as being less responsible because the risk of them causing harm is much lower. And so the split is usually split on a fractional basis or a percentage basis, and that affects the damages recovered by the injured person. So if they're 50% to blame for an accident, they will recover 50% damages. I think we're likely to see some effect on how those splits are decided by judges because of the changes in the Highway Code. But an e-scooter rider is subject to all the rules of the road, as we were saying earlier, which everyone else is subject to.
Yeah, which is why Pete said, I think we would all really welcome the legislation to come in for private users of e-scooters because, they have to abide by them anyway. So that really needs to come in so they're aware of that and that communication is out and everyone is safer on the roads.
Just like to touch quite quickly on a point that you made, Patrick, just in regards to negligence. In regards to, I guess, some of the case law and cases that you've seen, what is that bar at in terms of cyclists, e-scooters, riders? What amounts to negligence when it comes to an injury claim, for instance?
What amounts to negligence? Well, it is, as I say, it's the standard of the reasonably competent road user, whatever form of transport they're using, and the judge has to decide on the facts. As I said, each road accident can be very, very different. I think a good example of how the changes are affecting maybe the standard that's applied to different road users. One, which I think I really need to mention, which I didn't earlier, is the issue of behaviour at junctions now, that essentially road users in motor vehicles have to give way to a cyclist. If they're approaching a junction and the cyclist is going straight on and the car driver wants to turn left across them, it's the cyclist who has right of way. That's a big change. And where you've got provisions like that in the Highway Code, that can filter through in terms of how the judge then apportions negligence and indeed whether in fact there is negligence. Because if that's the rule, that cyclist should be entitled to plough on ahead to cycle across that junction without fear that they're going to be cut up by a car turning across them. And certainly that's how the law would treat it in court.
Absolutely. And I imagine, Pete, it comes back to that point that you made earlier. A lot of it is education, not just in terms of cyclists and e-scooter drivers knowing the rules, but drivers, pedestrians, people in buses, that everyone knowing that the rules will make it a lot safer down the line.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and this is a question for all three of you, I guess. What can be done to further improve safety?
I think infrastructure is really important, something we've not spoken a huge amount already. Obviously, as a pedestrian walking around Bristol city centre, I see lots of cycle paths everywhere. But then from talking to cyclists, I'm aware that they're not necessarily fit for purpose, that they're not necessarily in the right place. Pedestrians don't necessarily know where they should be in terms of the cycle. They're segregated a lot rather than having continuous cycle paths. You've got one for a bit and then either you're joining a main busy road again and then going back to one. So I just think there's a lot more work on infrastructure that can be done to help improve cyclists and e-scooter safety in particular.
I mean, I think it's very difficult, isn't it? Because educating the public is always a question of publicity, and publicity costs money. There are, of course, organisations and individuals like Peter who are able to put the message out there, but how much of it gets across will depend very much on funding. I think I'd rather talk myself about how to protect yourself if you're in an accident. And I think one of the important things as a motorist and very much cyclist too is if you've got a GoPro, if you've got a dash cam, make use of it. It's an interesting question. Charlotte asked me before we started this discussion how often I see camera footage now in cases that go to trial, and it's quite rare even now. And I know that these cameras are out there because I see them all the time in friends' cars. My partner's got one, and they're there and they should be used. The trouble is very often the camera isn't pointing the right way. It's not switched on. They've accidentally deleted the footage. They are important. They can make a difference. And I would say, although that won't necessarily stop the accident that's happened, it can help. It helps us all. I think it would help us all to behave better if we all knew that we were being monitored in that way, not in a Big Brother way, but there was some assurance there that a camera might capture a negligent action on the road.
Well, I'm in the middle of two very good points there. Yeah, I'd really reiterate, I think infrastructure improvements are very important. If you spoke to someone like Active Travel England, who are the body that will oversee a lot of things, they're going for quality, really. They're saying we need more high quality infrastructure because it's quality that wins out in terms of both it's stuff people want to cycle on, it's stuff that is safe, it's stuff that lasts the test of time. There is a degree of retrofit and improvements. So I'd say to people listening, you don't want to have to go back to university and learn all these guidelines, but it is going to take public consultation to get these things through. And you'll see, I guarantee everyone will have some kind of scheme within some few miles of them that's being proposed by way of a cycle lane design. So it helps if people even knew a little bit more about what was high quality, what they could expect from their local authority. And the extra layer of this is that local authorities are getting tooled up because there is more money and there are new standards, and the local authorities need design assurance in order to make really good schemes. Then on the fact of video cameras and surveillance, I looked up some of the numbers and it's increasing a lot. This is a piece of technology that sits alongside us. Avon and Somerset received 8,000 clips of footage last year, and it didn't go unnoticed. They made 2,500 prosecutions and sent 5,000 letters. So by my maths, that means a pretty high hit rate of enforcement off the footage that was sent in from the general public, of which oh no, I didn't do it last year. I did it in January. I got a camera for Christmas and have submitted a couple of pieces of footage, unfortunately. But this kind of thing will be important. I think all road users would probably have liked to see a bit more enforcement, but we've got probably would need another podcast episode as to why the police are often stretched thin pursuing other claims, and there aren't necessarily police vehicles driving around doing lots of enforcement, so we resort to quite a few cameras. But I think the stats go that motorists are breaking the law almost every day, and cyclists break the law too, and that if we had a lot more enforcement, we would probably be in a much happier place. But for now, the perception that a camera is on you is probably quite a useful one. And is probably might sound a bit Big Brothery, but the idea that would you be happy for a police car to happen to come around the corner, seeing you ... walk, cycle, drive? You should probably answer in the same way that you should drive the way that you'd be happy if your mother or your grandmother was on the back seat. So I think that's probably a way to go. The Department for Transport's Highway Code communications, for all that I think they fell short in reach and in media spend. They did have a nice line, albeit it didn't educate people as to the substance of the Highway Code updates, which was travel like you know them. And it was a nice little TV excerpt that was sort of like treat people as though you're passing someone that is your friend or family member, and don't throw a whole bit of rage and abuse, all for what in all circumstances. So I'll leave it there, but I'm pleased to sit between the two, and I think I agree improved safety would be a combination of sort of infrastructure and enforcement.
I think that's all the questions for me. Just before I finish up, is there anything else any of you think is worth adding, would like to include?
We didn't cover the car dooring. Well, one of the changes that grabbed a lot of media attention is the Dutch reach, which has come to us from the Netherlands. In fact, it's pretty standard, I think, over there, that the motorists, when they get out of the car, rather than, as we do generally out of habit, we use if you're sitting in the driver's seat, you'll use your right hand to open the door, and obviously you're coming out of the door without looking behind you over your shoulder. In the Netherlands, traditionally, the rule has been you use the other hand to open the door, and that forces you round, so that you're actually going into sort of like a blind spot check. And that's now Rule 239. So the Highway Code now requires us to do that when we get out of the car. Still, I don't think many people are doing it. And that could have enormous improvement. Could lead to enormous improvement, I think, in these cases where we see car dooring. So cyclists, most cyclists who are experienced cyclists are really well aware of this. There was a case back in 2004 called Burridge and Airwork Limited, and this was an awful case of a chap who was car doored by a guy in a small minibus who'd pulled over into the hard shoulder to check something, and he opened his door without looking, and the guy went straight into the door. And I think, on the one hand, this should improve safety for cyclists. On the other hand, if you aren't aware of the changes in the rules, which also incorporate a new rule where you're advised to keep at least half a metre out from the curb, and I think it's 1.5 metres out from the parked vehicles. I think that's right, Pete, isn't it? And that is the other half of this. So if everybody knows what the code says, which is drivers, Dutch reach, so you're looking back as you open that door, cyclists, maintain that distance as you pass parked cars. If everybody's doing both those two things, we should see a lot fewer injuries from car dooring.
Absolutely, and I imagine, Pete, from a cyclist point of view, that's a positive.
The nice thing about car dooring, I mean, we're aligned on our interests. Nobody wants to open their door onto oncoming traffic, and certainly no one wants to open their door onto a cyclist either. There are other aspects that seem more like trade-offs, or more there's like marginal winners and losers. So it's a very nice design solution that seems to be good for all, and it does lend itself well to communications. You could imagine in the 1970s or 80s, when there was a bit more invested in public communications for safety, this would have lent itself really well. It's got a sort of clunk click every trip sort of ring to it, and it should pay off. Yeah. For now, though, I mean, given that we know that not that many people are going to be doing it, cyclists just have to act as though a door might open upon them, and even if everyone was doing it, you'd probably still need to, as Patrick said, leave that gap between places. But it's a good piece of advice, I think.
Absolutely. I imagine there's that balance between the common sense doing what you need to do to make sure you're going to stay safe yourself, and also just not assuming the worst, but hoping that none of that does actually happen, and then you end up having to claim for an injury if you're a cyclist going into a car door at some speed. Right. Well, I think we'll leave it there for this chat. Charlotte, Pete, Patrick, I'd like to thank you all so much for your time and coming on the podcast and having a chat about the various cycling safety issues here in the Southwest. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for watching this episode of RWK Goodman's Legal Thinking Podcast. For more information on our firm's injury expertise, please visit rwkgoodman.com/injury. If you're keen to watch more from the firm, please feel free to subscribe here, or if you want to watch more legal thinking videos, please follow the playlist here. Thanks for watching.